most of you out there know by now that I live in Mexico, in Morelia, Mexico, central Mexico, and have been here for the last 5 years. And one of the several reasons that I was drawn to come to Mexico is because I do believe Mexico, like some, not all, some South American, Central American, Latin American countries, as well as parts of Southeast Asia, again, not all, but some of them are slower to adopt and adapt the technology and thus the technocracy, the surveillance state, the facial recognition, the biometrics and things like that. And during COVID, 1984, Mexico turned out to be a great place. You know, for me personally, myself and Miriam, we've been visiting Mexico since 2017 together. So we had already known that we were going to come to Mexico at some point. And when March 2020 came around and all this insanity with COVID 1984 was starting, and I knew something was up, and I was telling her, baby, we need to get out of here. We need to go. Let's go visit your grandpa in Mexico, and let's just sort of see how things turn out from there, because I didn't feel safe getting locked down in the US. And so we came down here March 2020. We ended up visiting her grandfather. And then long story short, we ended up in Morelia, where we live now and where we host the People's Reset as well. So we have settled here. We have land. We've got local community. We're bringing more community. This is where we do the event. Like, my life is out here. I'm in my studio, in my home, an hour from the land. Like, you know, this is where my life is now for all intents and purposes. So I say all that to say that to hear the news that I'm about to share, it is a little disturbing to realize that, okay, Mexico is advancing in terms of the technocracy and the biometric security surveillance state. It is not going to be immune. And I want to say this first. I never thought Mexico was going to be 100% immune from these things. And I think this is a mistake that some people make, whether they come to Mexico or they come to, you know, Vietnam or some other place that they think is going to be the safe place to be. You have to remember, this is a worldwide, internationalist, globalist agenda. Going from one country to the next, if you're coming with a sort of, I'm running away from Canada, from the US, from the UK, from Australia to Mexico, I think you're already starting off on the wrong foot. You shouldn't think of it as running away. I don't think about what we did as running away. I think about that we came here because Miriam has family out here, the culture, its affordability, the food, the people, all these sorts of things, right? And yes, it was a bonus that during COVID 1984, Mexico ended up being one of the only countries in the world that had no quarantine requirements, test requirements, vaccine requirements. And, you know, it's a big country, so not all parts of the country handled it equally. Some were worse than others, but by and large, the government was very skeptical about the vaccines. The government allowed people to have access to ivermectin. There wasn't this whole campaign like there was in the US to attack people who believed in the benefits of ivermectin. So by and large, Mexico was a better place to be during COVID 1984. That doesn't mean we didn't see any weird things. I mean, there were times at the mall, for example, where we saw them using the tablets and people just staring into the tablets, and it would scan their face and turn red or green, you know, to tell them if they had COVID or if they were safe to go in. We started seeing the rolling out of that stuff, and that was like, okay, that's a little scary. But again, these sort of things tend to roll out first in Mexico. I'll say specifically, I can't speak to any other country, but I think this is probably true in most places, in the big cities and particularly in the tourist spots. So Tulum, Cancun, Mexico City, obviously, Guadalajara, maybe to some degree, Monterrey, near the border. These places are big cities, and they also get a lot of tourists, a lot of English speakers. And we've realized over the years that means those places often are targeted to be the first places to push these types of technology. And also typically the expats and the Mexicans who are there seem to be compliant. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, because you're just getting people who are coming to Cancun on spring break and they don't care about, you know, fighting for liberty. They're just there to drink and party. So if they got to scan their face to do whatever, they're going to do it. So there were some places that we saw the technological, technocratic advancement, but it definitely wasn't, by and large, it wasn't the whole country. Where we were at, it was a little bit shut down, but never completely fully. And even when the government announced shutdowns, it never held. It didn't stick. And one other point before we get into the details of this story, there was also reports of various indigenous communities, small indigenous communities in very rural mountain areas of Mexico that were rejecting the COVID vaccines and that were telling the government, like, don't send the doctors in here because we can't, you know, we're not going to respect them. We're not going to guarantee that they're going to get out alive or be safe and things like that, because they have a distrust of the government and they didn't want the COVID shots to be forced on them. So I actually did reporting during COVID where we went and traveled to these towns and were able to meet with some of the locals, some of the elders, some of the leaders. They didn't want to speak on camera, but they did say as much, that they didn't trust the government. People were out there living like COVID wasn't even a thing. Was it a thing? And so there's a lot of parts of the country that I think are resistant and ignore what the federal government does. So I want you to keep all of what I just said in mind as we go through this story, because Mexico is one of those unique places that just because the government passes a law or the Supreme Court makes the decision or politicians make proclamations, it doesn't mean that it actually affects the day-to-day life in reality. And that can be good or it can be bad, because one example, the Supreme Court a couple of years ago actually said that cannabis was legal and that people have a right to, use it or possess it. But that doesn't mean the average cop on the street won't harass you over weed if you happen to have cannabis on you, right? So that's one example. In the reverse, they pass new laws about biometrics and trying to advance biometrics and take steps towards digital IDs. Will that play out in reality? Will that affect the average person on the ground in their real life? Well, we're about to find out. So let's go ahead and get into this new article. So this is my latest article for thelastamericanvagabond.com covering the situation. Published it just this last week. Mexico moves closer to biometric ID. Will the people comply? Privacy advocates are warning that a package of new laws recently passed in Mexico are a dangerous step towards requiring digital ID for all interactions. As of Thursday, July 17th, which is just about 10 days ago, several new laws went into effect in Mexico, which are likely to greatly increase the push towards a digital surveillance state. The Mexican government says these new laws are aimed at fighting organized crime, drug trafficking, and helping with the search for missing people. The government has also argued that controversial changes to the nation's telecommunications laws are designed to bridge the so-called digital divide, which is this phrase that I've heard for the last 7 or 8 years once I started to get into researching things like 5G. It's this idea that, and it is true to some degree, but it's the phrase, it's what they call the fact that cities and urban areas tend to get the internet and access to different technology earlier than people who are in the rural areas, in the countryside, in the mountains and things like that. So there are people, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in Mexico who are kind of in the countryside who might not have cell phones or even internet service. And obviously in today's world, most people kind of look at that as like a basic necessity. It isn't, but that's how we've come to view it. So the digital divide is the separation between the development of the internet and the spreading of that internet and cellular access in the cities versus in the countryside. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has claimed that critics who have referred to the laws as a, quote, spy law or a censorship law are ignoring protections that are built into the new measures. In a July conference just a couple of weeks ago, Sheinbaum said, quote, "It is a lie. It is false. It is a lie that the laws passed have to do with state spying. False. It is a deliberate lie," she said. The most concerning change relates to the personal identity code for residents and citizens of Mexico, known as the CURP, is how we say it in English. It's the Unique Public Population Registry Code, or CURP. So the CURP is similar to what you might call a social security number in the United States. It's 18 characters. And in Mexico, it relates to your family name. So you'll get a letter for one of your parents' names. There's a place of birth listed in there. There's the gender. And then, of course, just a set of numbers and characters. And so it's similar to a U.S. social security number that you have to use it if you're a citizen. You have to use it to get your INE, to be able to vote, to be able to, what you need to be able to get a bank account and a lot of different things. So it operates in a similar way to a social security card. And I will say this, people have already in the past couple of years, even before this law, because I've talked to friends who have become permanent residents in Mexico who are moving down here. And they've said when they did their CURP, to get their CURP, they already took their fingerprints and did a picture of their face and stuff. So this has been happening already. What the law does is make it where the CURP is going to include those things, a picture of your face and then a QR code containing biometric data such as your fingerprints or eyes, and that CURP will be necessary to do like everything, and that it is going to be integrated within the healthcare system as well. The law calls for the creation of a so-called unique identity platform within 90 days by the Ministry of the Interior and the Digital Transformation Agency. Mexico's Civilian Intelligence Service, the CNI, and the National Guard will also have access to this biometric data, which is kind of scary because you think like you're driving down the road and the National Guard, for those who've never been in Mexico, I mean, they drive around They're the military, and there's some corruption there. I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I definitely know that the government, the president, has a lot of power over the National Guard, and some would say they're kind of like their personal military. But let's imagine, because they do have checkpoints set up in different parts of Mexico looking for drug dealers and cartels. And let's say you get pulled over, they check your car, you've got nothing going on, but they want to run your data. They can check your data and it's in the system, it's logged. And if it's connected the way they want it to be, it's going to have a history of your purchases and your movements and all kinds of things. The new law says that the biometric CERP will also be required for purchasing internet and cellular service, and this would force businesses selling their services to check a customer's biometric CERP before a purchase. And the law is allegedly going to be in effect by February 2026, which is obviously just like 6 months away. So it's kind of scary for people. But as I wrote here, however, in a country known for having a weak federal government and rampant corruption, it remains unclear how the policies will be enforced. I found this Mexican attorney, Alejandro Peña, who was warning that the biometric CERP and the requirements for access to internet and phone service are not about protecting the country. He says, quote, "Are we protecting the country or controlling the citizens? The internet in Mexico will no longer be free." Another group called R3D, their director of local digital rights, Jose Flores, said that the laws will create a detailed map of individuals' activities. He said, quote, "This puts us in a massive surveillance ecosystem with no provisions to identify the wrong use of data, data breaches, identity theft, or acts of corruption." And so that's just part one. That's basically what the law is doing. Now, as I said, this thing is supposed to go into effect in February. They said that the law, they expected to be completed by February, but it went into effect as of the 17th. So just the other day, I went to a local corner store and I bought some SIM cards because they're saying that they're going to require biometrics for access to internet and phone service. And so you can go to the store here. The most well-known is OXXO, Ocho, and you can buy just SIM cards for phones. And you can do this anonymously for the most part, because I can walk into the store. I don't have to show ID. I can buy a SIM card and then I can take it to any random phone I have and I can put it in there and have cell service. And so you can buy as many as you like. And this is one of the things that a lot of people out here like in terms of anonymity, but it's also true that organized crime like the cartels have used them as well, because they recognize that there is a certain level of kind of separation between the person and their actions. And so they can buy a bunch of SIM cards, activate them, put them in random phones and use them to communicate and dump them as they need. If this goes through in the next 6-7 months, if this is true that by the end of February, beginning of February, then this will be implemented. Then when I would try to go buy a SIM card, they're going to ask me, okay, do you have your CERP? And it probably will end up being like an app on a phone, I'm sure eventually. And we'll see how that goes. But see, for me, I'm not a permanent resident. I'm not a temporary resident. I am just here on a tourist visa, and I travel back and forth every 6 months. This is just the way I do it. We do have land out here. I do plan on living here, but I'm probably going to go back and forth for as long as I can. I'm not interested in becoming a citizen of another government. So I'll have to see how this plays out. But as I said in the article, I don't necessarily think that it's guaranteed that this is going to play out the way they think, because Mexico, it is a big country with a spirit of resistance in a lot of places, including the state that I'm in Michoacan, and a history of revolution. And that doesn't mean everybody is an activist and everybody's a resistance fighter. A lot of people are going to go along with this. Clearly, most people are going to just go along to get along because they have to eat, they have to survive. And if they tell you it's necessary and you have no other option, then you're going to comply. This is why I've talked about for so long that we need to build parallel systems, because if there is nothing to opt out to or to exit to, you're going to comply whether you like it or not. So one other point here, Trump's role in the expansion of biometric collection. This was an interesting little tidbit that I found out as I was doing my research. The new laws could allow Mexico's security minister to establish data sharing agreements with other countries, including a potential deal with ICE in the U.S. to hand over biometrics of suspected illegal immigrants who enter the U.S. from Mexico. Donald Trump's ramping up of mass deportations of illegal immigrants and increased pressure on the Mexican government is also contributing to the rise of biometric data collection. In late March, U.S. Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem, she actually told Fox News that she'd met with Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, and told her that Trump wanted Mexico to share biometric information of immigrants in exchange for ending the tariffs on Mexico. Noem said at the time, she did sign some of the agreements with us, and I asked her specifically to share biometric information of migrants with us, and she's willing to discuss that, even though that in her country would be a little bit controversial. And this came shortly after Kristi Noem of the DHS had already facilitated agreements between the United States and Colombia for signing a, quote, statement of intent for biometric cooperation to manage migration. And at the time she said, quote, today we have signed a statement of intent for biometric cooperation, and it will reaffirm our strong and resilient and enduring partnership. So it seems like the Trump's pressure to, we got to stop illegal immigration and tariffs are being used as a way to force Latin American nations to start collecting biometric data of their own people in the name of, well, if they ever come over here illegally, we'll have a record of them and we can track them and things like that. I'm sure it's just about immigration. I'm sure it's not about controlling human movement altogether. Oh, yes. So one other piece here, the telecommunications law that could lead to censorship. Again, they're saying that requiring the CERP to verify a person before they give them internet or cellular access. This also comes along with telecommunications law changes, and some people say they're warning that the law will force internet service providers to share users' real-time location data with Mexican authorities upon request. But President Sheinbaum says that no data will be shared without a court order, and critics say that the changes will not require judicial approval before tracking a cell phone. So it's kind of like back and forth. She's saying, we're going to require a court order. Nobody's data is just going to be shared. And her political opponents are criticizing her and saying that's not true. They're going to track you. They warn that Mexican authorities will be able to shut down cell phone or internet service whenever and wherever they choose in the name of fighting crime. She said none of this is true and that, there's no censorship or no surveillance. But what I will say again is that the Morena party that Claudia Sheinbaum is part of, and that she basically inherited her presidency from the previous president, AMLO, they have a lot of political power now, and they have mostly control of the courts now due to recent laws that were passed in Mexico relating to the judges and how that system works. And it allowed her party to solidify now control over the judicial system, the political system. And as I said earlier, some would say the National Guard is directly under their control as well. So it's not likely to be much resistance, at least for the coming years. Now, to sort of take a bigger picture, is the Mexican technocratic state emerging? In 2021, I asked in this article, is the technocracy coming to Mexico? In response to similar developments that were happening back then, when they had a different plan where they were proposing to put millions of cell phone users' data in a biometric database. The bill also would require telecommunications company to install biometric equipment anywhere that cell phones were sold. Now that didn't progress, but obviously these new bills are essentially pretty similar. I also talked about how there was a law that was being approved at the time that could lead to a national ID system. Then I reported in 2023 how companies like the Thales Group, the World Economic Forum, and the United Nations were pushing for digital ID programs in Mexico. And I noted that the World Bank and the United Nations have been funding these programs through the ID4D initiative, which stands for Identification for Development, and that the World Bank funded digital biometric ID programs in Mexico as part of their efforts to complete the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 to get all these people into the banking system and on a digital ID by 2030. So you can kind of see that this is a part of a larger effort. And this is why I was saying, like, Mexico is not immune to these kinds of things. And so there's a lot of people in Mexico, especially expats and people who moved here, who are like, oh no, I can't believe I came here and now this is happening. I'm getting the heck out of here. And I think that's a problem, this idea that we should just, if something bad happens in one place, we just run away and just go to the next place. Look, I do think that for the most part, the U.S. is a lost cause. I go back there to visit family, and I also go back and I organize protests and I try to push back where I can in the U.S. But I see Mexico as my home now, and I want to continue to fight and push back here and organize with Mexican activists where I can. But I didn't come here to run away from the bad things in the U.S. I came here to build the life that I want. And that's what I want to invite people to think about. Don't think about it as like you're coming from one place to the next to run away, to hide. Like, it needs to be more than that. It needs to be based on more than just trying to run, and it can eventually just, keep avoiding things. At some point, you got to find home. You got to plant your roots, and you got to say, this is where I'm at, and this is where I'm staying, and I'm going to build community here. I'm going to focus on solutions here, and I'm going to resist this agenda everywhere I can. Because you can't run forever. I mean, you can, I guess, if you got the money and the resources, but eventually you're going to get stuck somewhere and you'll have no roots and no infrastructure and no relationships and things built because you just kept on running. So my advice is don't run. Don't think you can just run away from everything. Now, that doesn't mean if you're in a tyrannical situation or you're in a place where shit was crazy during COVID, you shouldn't consider moving. That's part of the exit and build strategy. Some people exit from one tyrannical place and they build another place where they think that they might have a better luck. But don't be always in this running mentality, running away, escape mode. I think that's a big problem. So the final segment here of this article, I say, what do these changes mean for the tens of thousands of foreigners who emigrated to Mexico over the last 5 years? Many people were inspired by Mexico's mostly relaxed response to the COVID-19 panic and decided to move their lives to the developing nation. Others have believed that Mexico's slower pace of adoption of emerging technologies meant that the nation would not embrace technocracy as rapidly as their northern neighbors in the US and Canada or Western Europe. However, despite the passing of these laws, it remains to be seen how the situation develops on the ground. The Mexican federal government is notoriously inefficient and lacks infrastructure and manpower to enforce this across the diverse landscape of the country, particularly in the rural areas. If there is to be a true resistance to the advance of the biometric security state, Mexicans and foreign expats must come together to form alliances to combat these invasive practices. And that's what I'm going to focus on. One thing is for certain, whether in Mexico or in any other nation, the only thing preventing the rolling out of the technocratic state is for the people to organize, to resist, and to opt out where possible. Without resistance, Mexico is destined to become yet another nation under the grip of the international surveillance grid. So that's what it's looking like, guys. I mean, I can't say it's looking super great, but it's also that all is not lost. You might have been seeing these, stories and headlines going around, and oh my God, Mexico's lost. It turned into digital ID. And like I said, just because the government says something on paper doesn't mean it affects everyday life for most people. And we're going to keep pushing back and fighting one way or the other. We're not going to give up just because the government claims they're going to implement some biometric system. I'm definitely working with and partnering with activists now more and more, where that's our focus now, is how do we partner with activists who are on the ground, who care about it. And thankfully, during COVID-1984, a good number of people did stand up and get organized. So we're starting to work with those people, and we're going to keep fighting no matter what, whether in the US or Mexico or elsewhere.
Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.